Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to this cozy corner of ancient history. I'm your host here at Rocked History, and before we begin our journey back to the magnificent temples and sun-baked streets of ancient Egypt, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled under the covers ready to drift off to sleep, or simply looking to unwind with some quiet historical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a delight to see the diverse community of history enthusiasts gathered here. And if you enjoy this style of calm, immersive tales from the past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss the next installment. But for now, let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to a time long ago, to the land of the pharaohs, to a world of gods beyond counting, to an Egypt that existed more than 3,000 years before our own time. Picture yourself standing on the banks of the great river Nile, the lifeblood of an entire civilization. The sun hangs low on the horizon, casting everything in a golden amber glow that seems to set the very air aflame. The waters of the Nile flow past you, eternal and unchanging, just as they have flowed for countless generations before you, and will continue to flow for countless generations to come. Along the riverbanks, fields of barley and wheat stretch out in neat rows, their stalks swaying gently in the evening breeze. Farmers wade through irrigation channels, guiding the precious water to their crops, their bronze skin glistening with the honest sweat of labor. In the distance, you can see the white sails of boats gliding along the river, carrying goods and people from one end of the kingdom to the other. This is Egypt in the 14th century before the Common Era, during what historians would later call the 18th dynasty, a time of unprecedented wealth, power, and religious devotion. But to truly understand the world we're about to explore, we must turn our gaze toward the great city of Thebes, the beating heart of Egyptian civilization, the crown jewel of the entire known world. Thebes was not merely a city in the way we understand cities today. It was a living testament to the power of the gods, a place where the divine and mortal realms seemed to blur and merge into something altogether magnificent. The Egyptians themselves called it Wazit, but it would be known to later generations by many names. The Greeks would call it Thebes, and the Egyptians sometimes referred to it as the City of 100 Gates, though this was perhaps more poetic flourish than literal description. What cannot be disputed, however, is that Thebes stood as the most important religious center in all of Egypt, and perhaps in the entire ancient world. As you approach the city from the river, the first thing that strikes you is the sheer scale of everything. The temples rise up from the earth like mountains crafted by divine hands, their massive pylons towering over the landscape, their walls covered in hieroglyphs and images of gods and pharaohs in eternal communion. The temples of Karnak and Luxor dominate the eastern bank of the Nile, their stone surfaces seeming to absorb the sunlight during the day and radiating it back in the cool of the evening. These were not simple places of worship, as we might understand them today. These were entire complexes, small cities unto themselves, housing not just shrines and sanctuaries, but also granaries, workshops, administrative buildings, and the homes of thousands upon thousands of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and servants. The temple complex at Karnak alone covered more than 200 acres, and it was still growing, with each successive pharaoh adding their own contributions, their own monuments, their own testament to the glory of the gods, and their own divine kingship. To walk through Karnak was to walk through a forest of stone columns, each one as thick as several men standing together, each one rising up impossibly high, their capitals carved to resemble papyrus flowers or lotus blossoms. The light would filter down through the stone roof in shafts of brilliant illumination, filled with the smoke of incense that burned constantly on 100 different altars. The air itself seemed thick with divinity, heavy with the presence of powers beyond mortal comprehension. But of all the gods worshipped in Thebes, one stood supreme above all others. His name was Ammonius-Ra, and he was the king of the gods, the hidden one whose power infused all of creation. Ammonius had not always held such an exalted position. In the earliest days of Egyptian civilization, he had been a relatively minor deity, associated with the city of Thebes when Thebes itself was just another provincial town. But as Thebes rose to prominence, so too did its patron god. When the pharaohs of the 11th dynasty reunified Egypt after a period of chaos and division, they elevated Ammonius to new heights. And when the 18th dynasty came to power, driving out foreign invaders and establishing an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north, Ammonius became something more than just another god. He became the supreme deity, the king of all gods, often merged with Ra, the ancient sun god, to become Ammonius-Ra, the hidden one who is manifest in the sun itself. The power of Ammonius-Ra was not merely spiritual or symbolic. In the world of ancient Egypt, where religion and politics were utterly inseparable, the god's power was very real and very tangible. The temples of Ammonius-Ra, and particularly the great temple at Karnak, had become immensely wealthy. They owned vast tracts of land, entire towns and villages, thousands of cattle, gold mines, and trade monopolies. Some historians estimate that by the time of the 18th dynasty, the temples of Ammonius-Ra controlled nearly one-third of all the cultivatable land in Egypt and employed hundreds of thousands of people. The priests of Ammonius-Ra were not simply religious functionaries. They were politicians, administrators, landowners, and power brokers. The high priest of Ammonius-Ra, who bore the title first prophet of Ammonius, was one of the most powerful men in all of Egypt, second only to the pharaoh himself, and sometimes, in practical terms, nearly equal to the pharaoh in influence and authority. Let us step inside the great temple of Karnak for a moment and experience what it would have been like to live and work in this place. Imagine yourself as a young priest, newly initiated into the lower ranks of the priesthood. You have spent years learning to read and write the sacred hieroglyphs, memorizing the endless prayers and rituals, studying the movements of the stars and the cycles of the Nile, learning the proper ways to prepare offerings and perform ceremonies. You have been examined by your superiors, your knowledge tested, your devotion proven. And now, at last, you have been accepted into the service of the great god Ammonius-Ra himself. Your day begins before dawn, in the cool darkness that precedes the sun's rebirth. You make your way through the sleeping temple complex, past the massive pylons that guard the entrance, through courtyards open to the sky, and into the hypostyle hall, that forest of 134 massive columns that seems to stretch on forever in the dim light. Your footsteps echo on the stone floor, mingling with the footsteps of hundreds of other priests, all making their way to their appointed tasks. The air is cool now, but you know that soon it will be thick with heat and smoke. You can already smell the lingering traces of yesterday's incense, that complex mixture of frankincense, myrrh, and other precious substances brought from distant lands at tremendous expense. You join the other priests in the sacred lake, the rectangular pool of water where all priests must purify themselves before entering the most holy parts of the temple. The water is cold, shocking you fully awake as you immerse yourself completely, washing away any impurity, any contact with the profane world outside the temple walls. You emerge dripping, and servants are waiting with fresh linen garments, blindingly white, for you to wear. Purity is everything in the service of the gods. You must be clean, ritually and physically, your body hair removed, your garments spotless, your mouth rinsed with natron to ensure even your breath is pure. Now comes the morning ritual, the most important ceremony of each day. As a lower-ranking priest, you will not enter the sanctuary itself, that innermost holy of holies where the cult statue of Ammonius-Ra resides, but you will participate in the elaborate series of rites that surround it. The high priest, or one of his senior deputies, will gold that flows in and out of the temple's vast holdings. There are overseers who manage the temple's farms and workshops, ensuring that the land is properly cultivated, that the craftsmen are producing the goods the temple needs. There are judges who settle disputes according to religious law, for the temple has its own legal jurisdiction. There are diplomats and ambassadors who negotiate with the pharaoh's court and with the representatives of other temples. And presiding over all of this is the high priest of Amonis-Ra, a man of immense learning, political acumen, and, ideally, genuine piety. The high priests of Amonis-Ra during the 18th dynasty were men of extraordinary power and influence. Many came from families that had held priestly office for generations, creating dynasties of religious authority that paralleled the royal dynasty itself. They were typically men of broad education, fluent in the complex theology of the gods, knowledgeable about astronomy and mathematics, skilled in administration and diplomacy. They wore distinctive regalia, the leopard skin draped over their shoulder, the sidelock of hair that marked them as servants of the god, the various amulets and symbols of their office. When they spoke, even the pharaoh would listen carefully, for these men claimed to speak with the authority of Amonis-Ra himself. And it was not just the priests who benefited from this system. Thebes as a whole flourished because of the temples. The constant demand for offerings meant that farmers had a ready market for their produce. The construction and maintenance of the temple buildings provided employment for thousands of laborers, masons, carpenters, and artists. The production of ritual implements, statues, furniture, and ceremonial items kept workshops busy year-round. The copying of religious texts, the manufacture of papyrus scrolls, the training of scribes, all of this created opportunities for learning and advancement. And during the great festivals, when pilgrims came from all over Egypt to visit the temples, the city's merchants, innkeepers, and craftsmen did brisk business. The temples were also centers of learning and preservation of knowledge. The temple libraries, called houses of life, contained vast collections of texts on every conceivable subject: religious rituals, medical treatises, mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, historical records, literature, and magic spells. Scribes would spend their days copying these texts, ensuring that ancient knowledge was preserved and transmitted to future generations. Students would come to study under the guidance of learned priests, and the brightest of these students might themselves one day join the priesthood or enter the pharaoh's administration as scribes and officials. But for all its magnificence and power, the religious system of ancient Egypt was also extraordinarily complex and sometimes contradictory. Egypt was not a monotheistic society. Far from it. The Egyptians worshipped hundreds, perhaps thousands, of gods and goddesses, each with their own mythology, their own cult centers, their own priests and rituals. Some gods were universal, worshipped throughout Egypt. Others were local deities, revered in one town or region but virtually unknown elsewhere. Some gods were cosmic in scope, embodying fundamental forces of nature like the sun, the sky, or the Nile. Others were more personal, serving as protectors of households, guardians of childbirth, or patrons of specific crafts or professions. The Egyptian pantheon was not organized in a neat, logical hierarchy. Instead, it was a sprawling, somewhat chaotic collection of deities that had accumulated over thousands of years as different regions were unified and different traditions merged. Gods could have multiple forms and aspects. They could merge with one another to create composite deities, like Amonis-Ra, who combined the attributes of Ammonius and Ra. The same god could be depicted in radically different ways in different contexts: as a human, as an animal, as a hybrid creature with a human body and an animal head. And the myths told about the gods often contradicted one another, with different versions of the same story offering completely different accounts of events. Take, for example, the creation myths. One tradition held that the god Adam had emerged from the primordial waters of chaos and created himself, then went on to create the other gods and the world. Another tradition said that the goddess Neith wove the world into existence. Yet another claimed that the god Ptah spoke creation into being through the power of his words. These stories were not seen as contradictory but rather as different perspectives on a truth too vast and complex for human minds to fully grasp. The Egyptians were comfortable with ambiguity and multiplicity in their religious thinking in a way that can seem strange to modern sensibilities. The gods were everywhere in ancient Egyptian life. They were in the great temples, yes, but also in small shrines in every home. They were invoked in spells and amulets worn for protection. They were present in the names people bore, for many Egyptians had names that incorporated the name of a god, Amenhotep, meaning Ammonius is satisfied, or Ramesses, meaning Ra has fashioned him. The gods were believed to be intimately involved in every aspect of life, from the flooding of the Nile that brought fertility to the fields, to the outcome of battles, to the health of children, to the success of business ventures. When something went wrong, it was because the gods were displeased or because malevolent spirits were at work. When something went right, it was because the gods had shown favor. The pharaoh himself was considered a god, or more precisely, the living incarnation of the god Horus, the falcon-headed deity who was the divine king. When a pharaoh died, he was believed to become Osiris, the god of the dead, and his son who succeeded him would become the new Horus. This divine status gave the pharaoh tremendous authority. His word was law because it was the word of a god. His commands could not be questioned because to question a god would be blasphemy. He was the intermediary between the gods and humanity, the one who maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance that kept the universe functioning properly. But being a god did not exempt the pharaoh from religious obligations. Quite the contrary. The pharaoh was expected to be the chief priest of all the gods, even though in practice he delegated most of these duties to the professional priesthood. The pharaoh was supposed to personally perform certain key rituals, especially during major festivals. He was responsible for building and maintaining temples, for ensuring that the gods were properly honored and provided for. If the pharaoh failed in these duties, if the rituals were not performed correctly, if the gods were neglected, then the cosmic order could collapse. The Nile might not flood, bringing drought and famine. Enemies might invade and conquer. Plagues and disasters might strike the land. The pharaoh's religious responsibilities were not ceremonial niceties, but matters of life and death for the entire nation. This was the world into which Amenhotep IV was born, probably around 1380 BC, though the exact date is uncertain. He was the second son of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, one of the most successful and powerful rulers in Egyptian history. Amenhotep III had reigned over Egypt at the height of its imperial power. The borders were secure, the treasury was full, and the pharaoh had undertaken massive building projects that added to the glory of Egypt and particularly of Thebes and its god Ammonius Ra. The great temple of Luxor was largely his creation, connected to Karnak by a long avenue lined with sphinxes. He built a mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile that was said to be the largest ever constructed, though little of it survives today except for the two massive statues of the seated pharaoh, known to the Greeks as the Colossi of Memnon. The young prince, who would eventually take the throne as Amenhotep IV, grew up in a world of unimaginable luxury and power. The royal palace at Thebes was a sprawling complex of buildings set in gardens filled with exotic plants and animals brought from across the empire. There were pools and fountains, shaded colonnades, rooms painted with elaborate frescoes showing scenes from nature and mythology. The prince would have been attended by servants whose sole purpose was to cater to his every need. He would have received an education befitting his royal status, learning to read and write hieroglyphs, studying the religious texts and rituals, learning the arts of warfare and statecraft, though as a second son, he was not originally expected to inherit the throne. But fate, or the will of the gods, had other plans. The older prince, the crown prince, who was being groomed for kingship, died. The details are lost to history, but his death meant that Amenhotep IV suddenly became the heir to the throne of Egypt. And when his father, Amenhotep III, died after a reign of nearly 40 years, the young prince ascended to the throne and took the name Amenhotep IV, the fourth pharaoh of that name, meaning, Ammonius is satisfied. It was a traditional name, honoring the great god of Thebes, and no one at the time could have guessed that this pharaoh would soon break with tradition in the most radical and shocking way possible. But before we turn to the revolution that Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, would unleash upon Egypt, let us linger a bit longer in this world of 1,000 gods, this world he was born into, and that he would ultimately try to overturn. Let us walk through the streets of Thebes and see the religion of Egypt not just from the perspective of the elite priests and royalty, but from the viewpoint of ordinary people as well. Picture yourself as a craftsman, perhaps a potter, who makes vessels used in the temples and sold in the markets. Your workshop is in the artisan quarter of Thebes, a neighborhood of narrow streets and closely packed houses where the smell of kiln smoke mixes with the aromas of baking bread and brewing beer. Your day begins early, before the heat becomes oppressive. You make your way through the awakening streets to your workshop, nodding greetings to neighbors who are also beginning their day. The baker is already at work, his ovens glowing. The metalworker is stoking his forge. The sound of looms clicking comes from the weaver's house. This is a neighborhood of skilled workers, people who have learned their trade through years of apprenticeship, often following in the footsteps of their fathers and grandfathers. Your workshop is modest but functional. There is a kiln in the back courtyard, a potter's wheel, shelves holding vessels in various stages of completion, and bins of clay that you purchase from merchants who bring it from the riverbanks where it is dug. You sit at your wheel and begin to work, your hands shaping the clay with movements made automatic by years of practice. As you work, you chant a short prayer to Khnum, the ram-headed god who is the divine potter, who fashioned humanity on his potter's wheel. You ask for his blessing on your work, that your hands might be steady, that the clay might be cooperative, that the firing might be successful. This is not just superstition or habit. You genuinely believe that Khnum can influence your work, and you have seen too many inexplicable failures and successes not to credit divine involvement. As the morning progresses, you are visited by a temple official, a scribe who is commissioning vessels for use in offerings at the temple of Mut, Ammonius consort. He examines your previous work, running his fingers over the smooth surfaces, checking the quality of the glaze, making sure there are no cracks or imperfections. He is particular and demanding, as he should be, for these vessels will hold offerings to the goddess, and nothing imperfect can be used in the service of the gods. You discuss the specifications, how many vessels, what sizes, what designs. You negotiate the price, though you know the temple will pay fairly, and being able to say that you make vessels for the temple will enhance your reputation and bring more customers. After the scribe leaves, you continue your work, but your mind wanders to the upcoming festival of Opet, one of the great annual celebrations of Thebes. During Opet, the statue of Ammonius Ra will be carried in a grand procession from Karnak to Luxor, and the entire city will celebrate. You are looking forward to it, not just for the religious significance, though that is certainly important to you, but also for the festive atmosphere, the chance to see the pageantry, to enjoy the special foods and drinks that will be distributed, to take a break from the routine of work. Your wife is excited because she has been saving to buy new clothes for the family, and Opet is the perfect occasion to wear them. Your children are thrilled at the prospect of the music and dancing, the acrobats and performers that will entertain the crowds. Religion, for you and your family, is not primarily about theology or abstract philosophical questions. It is about practice, about ritual, about maintaining the right relationship with the divine powers that govern your life. You make offerings at the small shrine in your house, burning incense and pouring libations, asking the gods to protect your family, to bless your work, to grant health and prosperity. When your wife was pregnant with your youngest child, you paid for amulets to protect her and the baby, inscribed with spells invoking Taret, the hippopotamus goddess, who watches over childbirth. When your oldest son was ill with a fever, you took him to a priest who was also a physician, who prescribed both medical treatments and magical spells to drive out the demon causing the sickness. You are aware, in a general way, of the great theological questions that the learned priests debate. You know that some priests say that all the gods are really just different manifestations of one ultimate divine reality, while others insist that each god is a distinct being with their own personality and will. But such debates are for the educated elite. For you, what matters is practical religion, knowing which God to pray to for which need, performing the proper rituals at the proper times, showing respect and devotion, and hoping that the gods will show favor in return. The temples, for people like you, serve as a kind of intermediary between the human and divine realms. You cannot enter the inner sanctuaries, where the cult statues dwell. Those are reserved for the priests. But you can enter the outer courts, you can leave offerings, you can address your prayers to the god through his priests. During festivals, when the god's image is carried through the streets, you can witness the divine presence, can feel the power and majesty of the god made manifest. And you can benefit from the temple's generosity during these festivals when food and drink are distributed to the crowds, when the temple acts as a source of social welfare, helping to ensure that even the poor have enough to eat during the celebration. But the temples are also powerful institutions that have a complex relationship with ordinary people. The temples own so much land that many farmers are essentially tenants of the temples, obligated to pay rent in the form of a portion of their harvest. The temples employ many people, which is good, but they also have their own interests and agendas that do not always align with those of the common folk. The priests live comfortable lives, exempt from many of the taxes and labor obligations that ordinary people must bear. There is a sense, perhaps not often voiced openly, that the priests have become very wealthy and powerful, that they have perhaps strayed from the pure devotion to the gods that should be their primary concern. Yet for all these complications, the religious system is simply the way things are, the way they have always been, the way they will always be. It is as much a part of the fabric of life as the Nile, as the sun that rises each morning and sets each evening, as the cycle of the seasons. To imagine Egypt without its elaborate religious system, without the temples and priests and endless rituals, would be like imagining Egypt without the Nile itself. It is unthinkable. Or at least, it was unthinkable until the pharaoh who began his reign as Amenhotep IV decided to think the unthinkable. But we are getting ahead of our story. For now, let us remain in this world of 1,000 gods, this world of temples and incense smoke, of priests and rituals, of prayers and offerings. Let us savor it, understand it, appreciate its complexity and beauty and contradictions, for this is the world that Akhenaten will challenge, the world he will try to overturn, and his revolution cannot be understood without first understanding what he was revolting against. The festivals of ancient Egypt deserve special attention, for they reveal much about the nature of Egyptian religion and its role in society. These were not solemn, somber occasions, but rather joyous celebrations that brought the entire community together. The festival calendar was crowded with observances, both great and small, marking the birthdays of gods, the anniversaries of mythological events, seasonal changes, and royal occasions. The largest and most important festivals could last for weeks and involve the entire city in a whirlwind of activity. Consider the beautiful Festival of the Valley, one of the major annual celebrations in Thebes. This festival honored the dead and the god Ammonius in his aspect as king of the gods. During the festival, the sacred bark of Ammonius, a ceremonial boat carrying the god's veiled statue, would be carried across the Nile from Karnak to the west bank, where the necropolises and mortuary temples were located. This was a journey from the realm of the living to the realm of the dead, a crossing of the threshold between worlds. The procession would wind through the necropolis, stopping at various mortuary temples where offerings would be made and rituals performed. But this solemn purpose was accompanied by a carnivalesque atmosphere. Thousands of people would follow the procession, many of them carrying offerings to leave at the tombs of their deceased relatives. Families would gather at ancestral tombs, clean and decorate them, leave food and drink, and then have a feast right there in the necropolis, sharing a meal with the spirits of the dead. It was believed that on this day, the boundary between the living and the dead became permeable, and the dead could partake of the offerings and enjoy the company of their descendants. There would be music and dancing, drinking and merriment, right in the midst of the tombs. To modern sensibilities, this might seem strange or disrespectful, but for the Egyptians, it was a way of affirming the continuity between life and death, of maintaining bonds with ancestors, of celebrating the eternal cycle of existence. Another major festival was the Opet festival, which we have already mentioned. Opet celebrated the divine marriage between Ammonius and Mut, and the renewal of the pharaoh's divine kingship. The festival lasted for several weeks, and during this time, the statues of Ammonius, Mut, and their son Khonsu would be carried from Karnak to Luxor in a grand procession. The procession route was lined with crowds, who came to catch a glimpse of the gods. Musicians played sistrums, drums, and flutes. Dancers performed acrobatic routines. Priests chanted hymns and prayers. The air was thick with the smoke of incense. When the procession reached Luxor, elaborate rituals would be performed in the temple, rituals that were said to renew the pharaoh's divine power and ensure the prosperity of the land for another year. During Opet, the people of Thebes and pilgrims from across Egypt would gather in the city. The temple would distribute rations of bread and beer to the crowds, an act of largesse that reinforced the temple's role as a provider and protector of the people. Markets would spring up around the temple complex, selling food, drink, souvenirs, and amulets. Entertainers would perform in the streets. It was a time of joy and celebration, a time when the normal routines of life were suspended and everyone could participate in something larger than themselves. These festivals served multiple purposes. On the religious level, they reenacted mythological events, maintained cosmic order, and renewed the relationships between gods and humans. On the social level, they brought communities together, reinforced social bonds, and provided a release valve for tensions and frustrations. On the economic level, they stimulated trade and commerce, distributed wealth, and displayed the power and generosity of the temples and the pharaoh. On the political level, they reminded everyone of the pharaoh's divine status and central role in maintaining order and prosperity. The festivals were, in short, absolutely central to Egyptian life, and the temples and priests who organized and conducted them were indispensable. The priesthood itself was a complex institution with many different ranks and specializations. At the top were the high priests of the major gods, powerful figures who were often appointed by the pharaoh and who might serve as advisors to the throne. Below them were various ranks of priests with specific responsibilities: Wab priests, who performed purification rites; lector priests, who read the sacred texts during rituals; Sem priests, who specialized in mortuary rituals, and many others. Some priests served full-time, living in the temple complex and devoting their entire lives to the service of the god. Others served on a rotating basis, spending a few months each year in temple service and the rest of the time pursuing other occupations. To become a priest required education and training. Boys who showed aptitude might be sent to temple schools where they would learn to read and write, study religious texts, and be initiated into the mysteries of the cult. The sons of priests often followed their fathers into the priesthood, creating priestly families and dynasties. But it was also possible for talented individuals from non-priestly backgrounds to enter the priesthood if they had the right connections and abilities. Women could also serve as priestesses, particularly in the cults of goddesses, though generally with less power and prestige than their male counterparts. The most important female religious role was that of the god's wife of Ammonius, a position held by a high-ranking woman, often a princess or queen, who served as the god's symbolic consort and who wielded considerable influence. The religious life of Egypt extended beyond the great temples to encompass a rich tradition of personal piety and popular religion. While the state cults focused on the great gods and the maintenance of cosmic order, ordinary people also worshipped a host of minor deities and protective spirits. There was Bes, the dwarf god who protected households and children, whose ugly face was believed to frighten away evil spirits. There was Tauret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, who watched over women in childbirth. There were local gods specific to particular villages or regions. There were deified ancestors and holy men. And there was a whole world of magic and supernatural belief that existed alongside the official religion. Magic was not seen as separate from religion, but rather as an extension of it. The same priests who performed temple rituals might also be consulted as magicians, who could write protective amulets, cast spells to cure, for transforming into various forms, for knowing the names of the gatekeepers who guarded the passages through the Duat, and for declaring one's innocence before the judges. These texts were written on papyrus scrolls or inscribed on tomb walls, and they varied depending on the wealth and status of the deceased. A wealthy person might have an elaborately illustrated scroll dozens of feet long, while a poorer person might have just a few key spells written on small papyri or even on wooden figurines placed in the tomb. The tomb itself was considered the eternal home of the deceased, and wealthy Egyptians spared no expense in preparing their tombs. The walls would be covered with painted scenes showing the deceased enjoying an idealized afterlife, hunting in the marshes, feasting at banquets, receiving offerings from family members, working in the fields of paradise. These images were not merely decorative. They were magical, designed to become reality in the afterlife. If you had an image of yourself receiving food offerings, then you would receive food offerings for eternity, even if your descendants eventually forgot to bring actual offerings to your tomb. The tombs of the pharaohs and highest nobility were on a scale that dwarfed anything ordinary people could afford. Hidden in the valleys and cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, these rock-cut tombs descended deep into the earth, with multiple chambers and corridors, every surface covered with religious texts and images. The burial chamber itself would hold a massive stone sarcophagus containing nested coffins of wood and gold, and within them, the mummified body of the deceased adorned with jewelry and amulets. Around the sarcophagus would be placed everything the deceased might need: furniture, clothing, food, wine, perfumes, games, weapons, chariots, even boats. The tomb of a pharaoh was essentially a complete household, frozen in time, waiting for its owner to return and resume life. This obsession with death and the afterlife might seem morbid to modern observers, but for the Egyptians, it was life-affirming. They prepared so elaborately for death precisely because they loved life and wanted it to continue forever. The afterlife was imagined not as some ethereal spiritual realm fundamentally different from earthly existence, but as a perfected version of life in Egypt. The blessed dead would still eat and drink, would still enjoy the company of family and friends, would still work their fields, though in the afterlife the work would be easy and the harvests always abundant. They would still worship the gods, still celebrate festivals, still experience joy and pleasure. Death was not an ending but a continuation, and a potentially eternal one. This brings us back to the temples, and the central role they played in maintaining the cosmic order that made such an afterlife possible. The daily rituals performed in the temples were not optional ceremonies, but essential acts that kept the universe. Illnesses, divine the future, or curse enemies. Magic worked, the Egyptians believed, because the universe operated according to certain principles that could be manipulated if one knew the right words and rituals. The gods themselves used magic, according to the myths. Isis, the great goddess, was said to be a powerful magician who had learned the secret name of Ra and thus gained power over him. If the gods used magic, then it was only natural that humans should do so as well. Illness was often attributed to demons or to the anger of gods or ghosts of the dead. Treatment therefore involved not just medicinal remedies, but also magical spells and rituals designed to appease or drive out the supernatural cause of the sickness. A physician might prescribe both an herbal medicine and a spell to be recited while taking it. Amulets inscribed with protective spells were worn constantly. Houses had niches for small gods whose images would protect the inhabitants. Children wore strings of amulets to guard against the evil eye and other dangers. The line between medicine, magic, and religion was blurry or non-existent. The Egyptians also had elaborate beliefs about death and the afterlife, beliefs that shaped much of their religious practice. Death was not the end but rather a transition to another form of existence. The dead continued to exist in the afterlife, in a realm called the Duat, which was both a physical place and a spiritual dimension. To successfully make the transition to the afterlife required proper burial and the preservation of the body, which is why the Egyptians developed the elaborate practice of mummification. It also required provisions, food, drink, clothing, and all the necessities of life, which is why tombs were filled with goods and why ongoing offerings were made at tombs. But the afterlife was not guaranteed. The dead had to pass through various trials and dangers. The most famous of these was the judgment scene, depicted in countless tombs and funerary texts, where the deceased would stand before Osiris, the god of the dead, and a tribunal of 42 divine judges. The heart of the deceased would be weighed on a great scale against the feather of Mut, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was heavy with sin and wrongdoing, it would outweigh the feather, and the deceased would be devoured by Ammit, a terrifying creature part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and would cease to exist entirely. But if the heart was light, if the deceased had lived a just and righteous life, they would be declared true of voice and granted passage to the blessed afterlife. To aid in this judgment, the dead were buried with collections of spells and instructions known as the Book of the Dead, though this modern title is somewhat misleading. The Egyptians called these texts the Book of Coming Forth by Day, and they were essentially guidebooks for navigating the afterlife. They contained spells for overcoming obstacles, functioning. Each morning, when the high priest awakened the god statue and performed the elaborate rituals, he was helping to ensure that the sun would rise, that the Nile would flood at the proper time, that Mut, the cosmic order, would prevail over Isfet, chaos and disorder. The gods needed humans to sustain them through offerings and worship, and humans needed the gods to maintain the natural order and provide protection and blessings. It was a reciprocal relationship, a cosmic contract that bound the divine and mortal realms together, but maintaining this system required enormous resources and constant vigilance. The temples consumed vast quantities of goods, food for offerings, animals for sacrifice, incense and precious oils, fine linens, gold and silver for the gods' adornments, papyrus for religious texts, and on and on. The construction and maintenance of the temple buildings required armies of workers. The education and support of the priesthood required substantial investment. All of this was funded through the temple's landholdings, donations from the pharaoh and wealthy individuals, and the temple's own commercial activities. The temple of Ammonius-Ra at Karnak was not just a religious institution, but an economic empire, and the high priest of Ammonius was not just a religious leader, but also a manager of this vast enterprise. By the time Amenhotep IV came to the throne, the power of the priesthood of Amuniasr had grown to the point where it potentially rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. The high priest commanded enormous wealth, controlled vast territories, employed hundreds of thousands of people, and claimed to speak with divine authority. The temple's influence extended into every aspect of Egyptian life: religion, economics, politics, education, law, and culture. No pharaoh could govern effectively without the cooperation of the temples, and particularly without the support of the powerful priesthood of Amunias-Ra. Was into this world of ancient traditions and entrenched power structures, this world where the temples of Amunias-Ra seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the pyramids themselves, that the young pharaoh Amenhotep IV would introduce ideas that would shake the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. But before we can understand the revolution that was coming, we must understand the man who would unleash it. Amenhotep IV remains one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in all of ancient Egyptian history. Even his physical appearance is a subject of debate and speculation. The artistic representations of him that survive are unlike any other pharaoh's portraits. Where other pharaohs are shown as idealized, powerful, perfectly proportioned figures, Amenhotep IV is depicted with an elongated skull, a long thin neck, a protruding belly, wide hips, and spindly limbs. His face is shown with thick lips, a long chin, and heavy-lidded eyes. These images are so distinctive, so strange, that scholars have debated for over a century what they mean. Some have suggested that Amenhotep IV suffered from some medical condition that caused physical abnormalities. Various diagnoses have been proposed: Marfan syndrome, Froelich syndrome, Antley-Bixler syndrome, and others. Each of these conditions could potentially explain some of the features shown in the artistic representations. But others have argued that the unusual artistic style was not meant to be a realistic portrayal but rather a symbolic or theological statement, that Amenhotep IV was deliberately portrayed in a way that emphasized both masculine and feminine characteristics to suggest a divine androgyny, a being who encompassed all aspects of creation. The truth is, we simply do not know. The mummy that is believed to be Amenhotep IV shows a fairly normal skeleton, though the identification of the mummy is not certain. What we can say with confidence is that Amenhotep IV chose to be portrayed in a radically different way from his predecessors, and this choice was part of a much broader program of breaking with tradition and establishing something entirely new. The early years of Amenhotep IV's reign appear, on the surface, relatively conventional. He was crowned as pharaoh, probably in his late teens, and he took the traditional royal names and titles. He married a woman named Nefertiti, whose name means, "The beautiful one has come," and who would become one of the most famous queens in Egyptian history. Together, they would have 6 daughters, though no sons that we know of. He continued his father's building projects, added to the temples, and performed the expected royal duties. But beneath this conventional surface, something was stirring. Even in the first years of his reign, there are hints of what was to come. Amenhotep IV showed unusual interest in a relatively minor solar deity named the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. The Aten was not a new god. References to the Aten can be found much earlier in Egyptian history, and Amenhotep IV's father, Amenhotep III, had shown some interest in the Aten. But what Amenhotep IV would do with the Aten would be unprecedented. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made a decision that would shock Egypt to its core. He announced that he was abandoning Thebes, the ancient capital, the city of Amunias-Ra, the religious heart of Egypt for centuries. He would build an entirely new capital city, dedicated to the Aten, on a virgin site in Middle Egypt, a stretch of desert that had never before been occupied or claimed by any god. This new city would be called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, and it would be located at the site we now call Amarna, and he changed his own name. No longer would he be called Amenhotep. Ammonius is satisfied. He would now be called Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, or Spirit of the Aten. This was not just a name change. It was a declaration of independence from the god Ammonius and the powerful priesthood that served him. It was a rejection of the entire religious tradition that had made Thebes the center of Egyptian worship. But Akhenaten did not stop there. He went further than anyone could have imagined. He declared that the Aten was not merely the supreme god, above all other gods. He declared that the Aten was the only god, that all the other gods of Egypt were false, that the elaborate mythology and theology that had been built up over thousands of years was wrong, that the countless temples and their armies of priests were devoted to beings that did not exist. This was revolutionary. This was, as far as we know, the first attempt at monotheism in human history, predating the Hebrew monotheism that would emerge centuries later. Akhenaten was not just elevating one god above others, as many pharaohs had done before. He was denying the very existence of all gods except the Aten. The world of 1,000 gods was being replaced by a world of one god. To understand just how radical this was, we must remember everything we have discussed about Egyptian religion. The gods were not abstract theological concepts. They were living presences that permeated every aspect of Egyptian life. They were in the home shrines, in the amulets people wore, in the prayers people said, in the festivals that marked the calendar, in the very names people bore. To declare that all these gods did not exist was to pull the rug out from under Egyptian civilization. It was to invalidate the practices and beliefs of countless generations. It was to suggest that the priests, who had devoted their lives to serving these gods, had been serving nothing, that the elaborate rituals performed daily in hundreds of temples were meaningless, that the vast wealth and resources dedicated to the cults of these gods had been wasted. And Akhenaten did not merely declare this as a theological proposition. He enforced it with the power of the state. Temples to the old gods were closed. Their revenues were confiscated. Priests found themselves unemployed. The names of the gods were chiseled out of inscriptions throughout Egypt. Particularly targeted was the name of Ammonius, the great god of Thebes. Wherever the name Ammonius appeared, it was systematically erased, even when it appeared as part of other names. Even Akhenaten's own birth name, Amenhotep, was erased from earlier monuments. The festivals that had brought joy and meaning to people's lives were canceled. The processions of the gods through the streets ceased. The distribution of food and drink from the temples stopped. The entire social and religious calendar that had structured Egyptian life for centuries was swept away. In its place, Akhenaten offered worship of the Aten, but this was a very different kind of worship from what the Egyptians were used to. The Aten was not depicted as a human or animal form, as other Egyptian gods were. Instead, the Aten was shown simply as the sun disk, with rays extending downward, each ray ending in a small hand. Some of these hands held the Ankh, the symbol of life, extending it toward Akhenaten and his family. The Aten had no mythology, no stories of battles with other gods or adventures or relationships. The Aten simply existed, as the sun exists, providing light and warmth and life to all creation. And here was another radical change. The Aten was not accessible to ordinary people. In the old religion, anyone could make offerings at temples, could participate in festivals, could seek the help of gods through prayer or magic. But the Aten could only be approached through Akhenaten himself. The pharaoh was the sole intermediary between the Aten and humanity. Only Akhenaten and his family could worship the Aten directly. Everyone else could only worship Akhenaten, who would then intercede with the Aten on their behalf. This elevated the pharaoh's status even beyond the already exalted position pharaohs had traditionally held. Akhenaten was not just a god among gods, as pharaohs had always been considered. He was the prophet and sole representative of the one true God. He claimed a special, unique relationship with the Aten. He said that the Aten had revealed itself to him, had chosen him, had given him special knowledge and insight. He described himself as the son of the Aten, created by the sun god to be its representative on earth. The city that Akhenaten built, Akhetaten, was designed to embody these new religious ideas. The site was chosen carefully, at a place where the cliffs on the east bank of the Nile curved back to form a natural bay. This curve in the cliffs was said to resemble the hieroglyph for horizon, Ak, and it was here that the sun rose each morning, emerging from the horizon as the Aten made its daily journey across the sky. Akhenaten marked the boundaries of his new city with a series of large stones steely carved into the cliffs. On these boundary stelae, he described his vision for the city and his reasons for building it. He claimed that the Aten itself had chosen this site, that no one, neither god nor king, had ever claimed this land before, and that here he would build a capital worthy of the one true God. The construction of Akhetaten proceeded with remarkable speed. Akhenaten was in a hurry, driven by a vision that could not wait. Within a few years, a complete city had risen from the desert, palaces for the royal family, temples to the Aten, administrative buildings, workshops, houses for officials and workers, even a village for the laborers who worked on the tombs being cut into the cliffs. The city was built primarily of mud brick, which allowed for rapid construction, though the most important buildings were faced with white limestone that gleamed in the sunlight. The great temple of the Aten dominated the city. But this temple was utterly unlike the traditional Egyptian temples. The temples of the old gods, like Karnak, were dark and mysterious places, with massive stone walls blocking out the sun, with dim interiors where the god statue dwelt in near total darkness, accessible only to the highest-ranking priests. The temple of the Aten, by contrast, was wide open to the sun. It had no roof. Its courtyards were filled with hundreds of offering tables, all exposed to the sky, so that the Aten's rays could shine down directly on the offerings. There was no dark sanctuary, no hidden cult statue. The object of worship was visible to all, the sun itself, sailing across the open sky above the temple. Akhenaten and Nefertiti moved to the new city and made it their home. They brought with them the court, the administration, the artists and craftsmen. Akhetaten became the capital of Egypt, the center of government, the place where the pharaoh lived and ruled. But it was also a city with a purpose, to demonstrate and propagate the worship of the Aten. The art produced at Akhetaten was as revolutionary as the religion. We have already mentioned the unusual way Akhenaten himself was portrayed, but the changes went far beyond that. Traditional Egyptian art had been highly formal and conventional, following strict rules that had been established in the earliest dynasties and had remained largely unchanged for nearly 2,000 years. Figures were shown in composite poses, the head in profile, the eyes shown frontally, the shoulders frontal, the waist and legs in profile. Pharaohs were always shown as strong, youthful, perfect physical specimens. Queens and princesses were idealized beauties. Everything was orderly, balanced, and eternal Amarna art broke many of these conventions. Figures were shown in more naturalistic poses. Akhenaten and his family were depicted in informal, intimate scenes, Akhenaten kissing his daughter, the royal family dining together, Nefertiti sitting on Akhenaten's lap. These are images we never see in traditional Egyptian royal art, where pharaohs are always shown in stiff, formal poses, performing rituals or smiting enemies. The bodies of the royal family, as we have noted, were shown with those distinctive elongated, almost alien proportions. Even the hieroglyphic writing changed, with Akhenaten promoting a more colloquial form of Egyptian rather than the formal literary language traditionally used for royal inscriptions. This artistic revolution was not just aesthetic. It was theological. The naturalism, the informality, the emphasis on the royal family's humanity rather than their divine perfection, all of this was meant to convey something about the nature of Akhenaten's relationship with the Aten. Akhenaten was presenting himself not as a distant, godlike figure, but as a living person with whom the god had a real, intimate relationship. The art showed him bathed in the light of the Aten, the sun's rays ending in hands that touched him and gave him life. Through the art, Akhenaten was making visible the invisible, the power and presence of the Aten, and his own unique relationship with this god. Akhenaten was also a poet, or at least he is credited with composing one of the most beautiful religious texts to survive from ancient Egypt, the Great Hymn to the Aten. This hymn, found inscribed in the tomb of I, one of Akhenaten's officials, is a masterpiece of ancient poetry that expresses a vision of God and creation that is remarkably sophisticated and, to modern ears, surprisingly appealing. The hymn begins with a description of the setting sun and the darkness that follows. You set in beauty in the western horizon of the sky, and the land is in darkness, in the manner of death. People sleep in their chambers, heads covered, one eye cannot see another. If all their possessions which are under their heads were stolen, they would not know it. Every lion comes forth from its den, all serpents bite. Darkness reigns, the land is in stillness, for he who made them rests in his horizon. Then comes the dawn, and the Aten rises. When you rise in the eastern horizon, you fill every land with your beauty. You are beautiful, great, dazzling, high over every land. Your rays encompass the lands to the limit of all you have made. You are Ra, and you reach to their limit, and subdue them for your beloved Son. Though you are far away, your rays are upon the earth. Though you are in the faces of men, your movements are unseen. The hymn goes on to describe how the Aten creates and sustains all life. You made the earth as you wished, you alone, all people, herds, and flocks, all upon earth which walk on legs, all on high which fly with their wings. The lands of Syria and Cush, the land of Egypt, you set every man in his place, you supply their needs. Everyone has his food, his lifetime is counted. Their tongues differ in speech, their characters likewise, their skins are different, for you have made foreigners different. What is striking about this hymn is its universalism. The Aten is not just the god of Egypt, but the creator and sustainer of all peoples and all lands. The Aten provides for Syrians and Cushites just as it provides for Egyptians. All humans, regardless of their nationality or language, are the Aten's creation. This was a radical departure from traditional Egyptian religion, which was deeply nationalistic. The old gods were Egyptian gods, concerned primarily or exclusively with Egypt. They fought Egypt's enemies, gave victory to Egyptian armies, blessed Egyptian land. But the Aten, according to Akhenaten's vision, transcended national boundaries. The Aten was a cosmic deity whose care extended to all of creation. The hymn also emphasizes the Aten's role as creator and sustainer of life in terms that are vivid and personal. You make the child grow in his mother's womb. You soothe him so that he does not cry. Nurse in the womb, giver of breath to animate all that he has made. When he comes forth from the womb on the day of his birth, you open his mouth completely, you supply his needs. When the chick in the egg chirps inside the shell, you give him breath within it to sustain him. You have made him, his appointed time to break forth from the egg, to come forth from the egg to cry out at his completed time. He walks upon his legs when he comes forth from it. This attention to the details of life, the tenderness toward the unborn child and the hatching chick, gives the hymn an emotional warmth that is unusual in ancient religious texts. The Aten is not a distant, abstract principle, but a loving creator intimately involved with its creation. The hymn concludes with praise for the Aten and acknowledgement of Akhenaten's unique relationship with the god. O sole God, without another beside you, you made the earth as you wished, you alone, with people, herds, and all flocks, all upon earth which walk on legs, all on high which fly with their wings. You are in my heart. There is none other who knows you except your son Akhenaten. You have made him wise in your plans and your power. This last section makes explicit the claim that underpinned Akhenaten's entire religious revolution. He alone truly knows the Aten. He alone has been made wise in the god's plans. Everyone else must approach the Aten through him. The great hymn to the Aten has fascinated scholars and readers for over a century since its discovery. Some have noted similarities between it and Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible, leading to speculation about possible influence or shared sources. Others have simply admired it as a beautiful expression of religious devotion and cosmic wonder. But in its historical context, the hymn was also a political and theological statement, a declaration of a new religious order with Akhenaten at its center. Life in Akhetaten must have been strange for those who lived there. The city was isolated, both geographically and culturally, from the rest of Egypt. It was built in the middle of nowhere, far from the old centers of population and power. The officials and courtiers who moved there had left behind their ancestral homes, their family tombs, their connections to the old religious establishment. They were starting over in a new world, according to new rules. The city seems to have been divided into distinct zones. The central city contained the royal palaces, the great temple of the Aten, and the administrative buildings. There was a northern palace, possibly used by the Queen Mother or another member of the royal family. The southern part of the city contained the suburbs where the nobles and officials had their large houses, each one a miniature estate with workshops, gardens, and servants' quarters. Further south was the workers' village, a small, walled community where the craftsmen and laborers who worked on the royal tombs lived in much more modest conditions. The houses of the wealthy officials at Akhetaten give us a glimpse into the lives of the elite. These were spacious villas built around central courtyards, with multiple rooms for different purposes, reception halls where the owner would entertain guests and conduct business, private family quarters. The one true God, people were hedging their bets, keeping the old gods close, just in case. Outside of Akhetaten, in the rest of Egypt, resistance was probably much stronger, though it had to be quiet resistance. The temples of the old gods had been closed, their priesthoods disbanded, their wealth confiscated. But the belief in those gods could not be so easily erased. People had been raised with those beliefs, had inherited them from countless generations of ancestors. The gods were woven into the very fabric of Egyptian identity. To be told that these gods did not exist, that devotion to them was foolishness or even blasphemy, must have been deeply disturbing and offensive to many Egyptians. The priests of Amunias-Re, in particular, must have been furious. They had been stripped of their power, their wealth, their purpose. The great temples that had taken centuries to build stood empty and silent. The daily rituals that had been performed without fail for generations had ceased. From their perspective, Akhenaten was not a visionary prophet but a heretic and a destroyer, a pharaoh who had violated his most sacred duty to maintain Ma'at and honor the gods. But what could they do? Akhenaten was the pharaoh, the living god, the absolute ruler of Egypt. To openly defy him would be treason. The army and the administration, for the most part, remained loyal to him, or at least obedient. There was no organized opposition, no rebellion. The priesthood of Ammonius was powerless, and they could do nothing but wait and hope that this madness would end. And it did end, though not in the way anyone expected. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years, which is actually a fairly long reign by ancient standards. For 17 years, he pursued his religious revolution with single-minded determination. He never wavered, never compromised, never acknowledged that his reforms might have been too radical or too fast. He seems to have genuinely believed that he was doing the will of the Aten, that he was enlightening Egypt, freeing it from the delusions of polytheism and establishing true worship. But during those 17 years, other things were happening in the world beyond Egypt's borders. The great empire that Akhenaten's father and grandfathers had built began to fray. Egypt's vassals in Syria and Canaan, the small kingdoms and city-states that paid tribute to Egypt and looked to Egypt for protection, found themselves under pressure from other powers. The Hittite Empire to the north was expanding. Local rulers were scheming and fighting among themselves. And Egypt, under Akhenaten, was not responding. We know this from an extraordinary archive of diplomatic correspondence discovered at Akhetaten, the Amarna letters, as they are now called. These are clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform writing, the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East. They are letters from foreign rulers to the pharaoh, and they paint a picture of growing chaos and desperation. The rulers of cities like Jerusalem, Megiddo, and Byblos write to Akhenaten begging for help, reporting attacks by enemies, pleading for Egyptian troops to protect them. Some letters arrive one after another from the same ruler, each more desperate than the last, wondering why the pharaoh does not respond, why Egypt has abandoned them. Did Akhenaten read these letters? Did he care? We do not know. Perhaps he was so focused on his religious mission that he neglected the practical business of empire. Perhaps he believed that the Aten would protect Egypt without the need for military campaigns. Perhaps he simply trusted his officials to handle such matters, and did not involve himself in the details. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. Egypt's prestige and power in the region declined during Akhenaten's reign. By the time he died, much of Egypt's empire in Syria and Canaan had been lost. The end of Akhenaten's reign is shrouded in mystery. We know he died in the 17th year of his rule, around 1336 BC, but the circumstances are unclear. Was it natural death? Assassination? We do not know. We know that his chief wife, the beautiful Nefertiti, seems to have disappeared from the record a few years before Akhenaten's death. What happened to her is one of the great mysteries of Egyptology. Some scholars think she died. Others think she fell from favor. Still others believe she may have ruled jointly with Akhenaten toward the end of his reign under a different name, though this theory is controversial. What happened after Akhenaten's death is clearer, at least in outline. He was succeeded by a young man named Smenkhare, who may have been Akhenaten's son or perhaps his brother. Smenkhare's reign was very brief, only a few years, and he remains an obscure figure. After Smenkhare came another young man, a boy Rili, who took the throne named Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten. But this boy king would not keep that name for long. Within a few years, he would change his name to Tutankhamen, the living image of Ammonius. The god of Thebes was back. Tutankhamen was probably about 9 years old when he became pharaoh. He was almost certainly Akhenaten's son, though his mother's identity is debated. Being so young, he could not rule on his own. Real power was held by his advisors, particularly two men, who had been an important official under Akhenaten and who may have been related to the royal family, and Horemheb, a general who had commanded Egypt's armies. These men were practical politicians, not religious visionaries. They could see that Akhenaten's revolution had been a disaster. Egypt had been weakened abroad and divided at home. The economy had suffered. The closure of the temples had disrupted the social and economic systems that had sustained Egyptian society for centuries. The people were unhappy, the priesthood was angry, and the old gods were calling out for restoration. Under Tutankhamun's name, though undoubtedly with the guidance of and Horemheb, a restoration began. The old gods were officially reinstated. The temples were reopened. New priests were appointed or old priests recalled to service. The worship of Ammonius Ra was restored to its former prominence. Resources were devoted to repairing the temples that had been neglected or damaged during Akhenaten's reign. A decree was issued, often called the Restoration Stela, which described the terrible state Egypt had fallen into under the heretic king and the glorious restoration of the proper order under the young Tutankhamun. The Stela's text is worth quoting, as it gives us the official view of Akhenaten's reign from those who came after. Now when his majesty arose as king, the temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine down to the marshes of the delta had gone to pieces. Their shrines had become desolate, had become mounds overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never been. Their halls were a footpath. The land was topsy-turvy, and the gods turned their backs upon this land. If the army was sent to Jahi to extend the frontiers of Egypt, no success of theirs came at all. If one prayed to a god to seek counsel from him, he would never come at all. If one made supplication to a goddess similarly, she would never come at all. Their hearts were hurt in their bodies, so they did damage to that which had been made. This paints a dramatic picture of Egypt under Akhenaten as a land abandoned by the gods, falling into chaos and ruin. Whether this is accurate or exaggerated propaganda is impossible to say. Certainly it was in the interest of the Restoration government to paint the previous regime as a complete failure. But there was probably truth in it too. The religious changes had disrupted Egyptian society in profound ways. The Restoration continued. Akhetaten, the city of the Aten, was abandoned. The court moved back to Thebes, the ancient capital. The nobles and officials who had built those fine houses at Akhetaten left them behind. The workers and craftsmen packed up and moved away. Within a generation, Akhetaten was a ghost town, empty buildings slowly crumbling in the desert. Eventually, even the stones would be carried away and reused in other buildings. The city that was supposed to be an eternal capital, the horizon of the Aten, lasted barely 20 years. Tutankhamun died young, in his late teens, after reigning for only about 10 years. We know more about his death and burial than we do about his life, because his tomb, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, was found largely intact, filled with the treasures that made it one of the most famous archaeological discoveries of all time. But Tutankhamun himself, despite the fame his tomb brought him, was a minor pharaoh who accomplished little. His main historical significance is that he presided over, or at least lent his name to, the abandonment of his father's religious revolution and the restoration of the old order. After Tutankhamun came I, the advisor who had served both Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. I was an old man by this time, and his reign was brief, only 4 years. After I came Horemheb, the general, and with Horemheb, the 18th dynasty effectively ended, though officially he is counted as its last pharaoh. Horemheb had no royal blood, but he had the army's loyalty, and that was what mattered. He ruled for nearly 30 years, and during that time, he worked systematically to erase Akhenaten from history. Horemheb went further than simply reversing Akhenaten's policies. He tried to make it as if Akhenaten had never existed. Akhenaten's names were chiseled out of inscriptions. His monuments were torn down. The stones from his buildings were used as fill in new construction, or buried in foundation deposits, where they would never be seen. Official king lists simply skipped from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, as if the years between had never happened. Akhenaten became a non-person, erased from official memory, later Egyptian texts, when they had to refer to this period at all, called Akhenaten, the criminal, or the rebel, or the enemy from Akhetaten. They never used his name. He had become, in official history, the heretic king, the pharaoh, who had betrayed the gods and nearly destroyed Egypt. His city was referred to, when it was mentioned at all, as the place of disorder, or the enemy's city. This damnatio memoriae, this condemnation of memory, was remarkably successful. For over 3,000 years, Akhenaten remained largely forgotten. The ancient Greeks and Romans, who wrote extensively about Egypt, never mentioned him. When modern scholars began to study ancient Egypt in the 19th century, they knew nothing of Akhenaten. It was only in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when archaeologists began excavating at Amarna, and when inscriptions mentioning Akhenaten were discovered and deciphered, that his story began to emerge from the shadows. And what a story it was! The discovery of Akhenaten and his religious revolution caused a sensation. Here was a figure from the ancient world who seemed remarkably modern, a monotheist, a religious reformer, perhaps even a humanitarian with his emphasis on the Aten's universal care for all people. Some scholars hailed him as a visionary, the first individual in history, a man ahead of his time who tried to lift humanity to a higher spiritual plane. Sigmund Freud even wrote a book arguing that Akhenaten's monotheism had influenced Moses, and was thus the ultimate source of Jewish and Christian monotheism, though this theory is not accepted by most scholars. But as more evidence has been discovered and studied, the picture has become more complex and ambiguous. Akhenaten's revolution was not the benevolent enlightenment that some early admirers imagined. It was imposed by force, enforced by the state, and it brought real hardship to many people. The closure of the temples put thousands out of work. The suppression of traditional religious practices must have caused genuine anguish to people who had grown up with those practices and depended on them for spiritual comfort and community identity. The concentration of all religious authority in the person of the pharaoh was not liberation, but a form of totalitarianism. And Akhenaten's monotheism was not quite like the monotheism of later religions. It was not based on moral or ethical principles, at least not explicitly. The Aten did not give commandments or demand justice and righteousness. The worship of the Aten was centered entirely on Akhenaten himself. It was less a universal religion than a royal cult, a religion that existed to glorify the pharaoh and reinforce his absolute power. Moreover, Akhenaten's neglect of Egypt's foreign interests had real consequences. The loss of the empire meant lost tribute, reduced prestige, and potentially greater security threats. Egyptian soldiers died in futile attempts to hold positions that did not receive adequate support. Foreign rulers who had depended on Egypt felt betrayed and abandoned. The consequences of Akhenaten's religious obsession rippled far beyond the borders of Egypt. So, how should we judge Akhenaten? Was he a visionary or a fanatic? A religious pioneer or a dangerous heretic? A man of spiritual genius or a destructive narcissist? Perhaps he was all of these things. Perhaps he was a complex, contradictory figure who defies easy categorization, as all real human beings do. What we can say with confidence is that Akhenaten was one of the most remarkable figures in ancient history. For better or worse, he tried to change the world, to overturn thousands of years of tradition and establish something entirely new. He failed, and his failure was so complete that his enemies were able to erase him from memory for 3 millennia. But the very audacity of the attempt, the sheer ambition of trying to remake an entire civilization's relationship with the divine, marks him as an extraordinary individual. The world of 1,000 gods that we have explored in this journey, that elaborate, beautiful, contradictory system of belief and practice, proved to be far more resilient than Akhenaten ever imagined. Within decades of his death, it had reasserted itself completely, as if his revolution had been nothing more than a brief, strange dream. But the very fact that such a revolution could happen at all tells us something important about the nature of ancient Egyptian society and religion. For all its apparent permanence, for all its emphasis on tradition and eternal order, Egyptian civilization was capable of dramatic change when circumstances and individuals aligned in the right way. Akhenaten's revolution may have failed, but it demonstrated that even the most entrenched religious systems are vulnerable to challenge, that even the most powerful institutions can be overturned, at least temporarily, by a determined ruler with a compelling vision. The restoration that followed Akhenaten was not simply a return to the old ways. It was, in some sense, a reimagining and reinvigoration of those ways. The trauma of the Amarna period had shaken Egyptian society to its foundations. The old certainties had been questioned, the old gods had been challenged, and even though the traditional religion had been restored, something had changed. The restoration was self-conscious in a way that the pre-Amarna religion had not been. Egyptians now knew that their religious system was not inevitable, not immutable, that it could be challenged and nearly destroyed. This knowledge seems to have led to a renewed commitment to the old gods and the old ways. The pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, the dynasty that followed after Horemheb, were zealous in their devotion to the traditional gods, particularly Ammonius Ra, Seti I and his son Ramesses II, the greatest pharaohs of this new dynasty, built and restored temples on a massive scale. Ramesses II, in particular, became perhaps the most prolific builder in all of Egyptian history, adding to existing temples and constructing new ones throughout Egypt and Nubia. His mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, and the magnificent temples at Abu Simbel stand as testaments to the restored power and confidence of the traditional religious establishment. The priesthood of Ammonius Ra, humiliated and nearly destroyed under Akhenaten, emerged from the restoration period more powerful than ever. The pharaohs, perhaps feeling guilty about what had been done to the temples and priests during the Amarna period, or perhaps simply recognizing the political necessity of having the priesthood as an ally rather than an enemy, showered the temples with gifts and privileges. The temple of Ammonius at Karnak grew even larger and wealthier than it had been before Akhenaten. The high priests of Ammonius once again became figures of immense political power and influence. But this restored power would eventually prove problematic. By the end of the 20th dynasty, several generations after the Amarna period, the high priests of Ammonius had accumulated so much wealth and power that they effectively controlled all of Upper Egypt. When the royal line weakened, the high priests simply took over, establishing themselves as pharaohs in their own right. For a time, Egypt was divided, with the high priest ruling the south from Thebes and a pharaoh of a different line ruling the north from the delta. The very institution that Akhenaten had tried to destroy had become so powerful that it could challenge and even replace the royal authority itself. This outcome would have appalled Akhenaten, but it might also have vindicated his concerns. He had seen the power of the Ammonius priesthood as a threat to royal authority, and in the long run, he was proven right. His solution, the imposition of monotheism and the elimination of the priesthood, had been too radical and had failed. But the problem he identified, the excessive power of the religious establishment, was real and would continue to plague Egyptian monarchy. Let us step back now and consider the broader significance of the religious world we have been exploring. The religion of ancient Egypt was not just a set of beliefs about gods and the afterlife. It was a total system that encompassed every aspect of life: politics, economics, art, science, medicine, law, and social organization. Religion provided the framework within which Egyptian civilization understood itself and the world. The gods were not abstract theological concepts, but active agents in the world. When the Nile flooded each year, bringing the fertile silt that made agriculture possible, this was not understood as a natural phenomenon, but as the action of Hapi, the god of the Nile flood. When a woman conceived a child, this was the work of Khnum shaping the child on his potter's wheel, or of other gods presiding over conception and birth. When a pharaoh won a victory in battle, this was because the gods had fought alongside the Egyptian army. When disease struck, it was because demons or angry spirits were at work. When someone recovered from illness, it was because the right spells and offerings had been made to appease or drive out the supernatural cause. This way of understanding the world might seem primitive or superstitious to modern minds, but it was internally consistent and, for the Egyptians, it worked. It provided explanations for why things happened. It gave people a sense of control over their circumstances through ritual and magic, and it embedded human life within a larger cosmic order. The universe was not a cold, impersonal mechanism operating according to natural laws, but a living cosmos filled with divine powers and purposes. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at is central to understanding this worldview. Ma'at was the principle of order, truth, justice, and balance that kept the cosmos functioning properly. Ma'at was both a goddess and an abstract principle. She was depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head, and that feather was used in the judgment of the dead, weighed against the heart of the deceased. But Ma'at was also the cosmic order itself, the way things were supposed to be. Everything in Egyptian religion was ultimately about maintaining Ma'at. The daily temple rituals sustained Ma'at by keeping the gods content and powerful. The pharaoh's role was to maintain Ma'at by ruling justly, performing rituals, building temples, and defending Egypt from enemies. Even ordinary people participated in maintaining Ma'at by living according to proper ethical principles, respecting the gods, and fulfilling their social duties. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, chaos and disorder, which constantly threatened to break through and destroy the ordered cosmos. Isfet lurked in the desert beyond the cultivated lands, in the chaos waters that surrounded the world, in death and disease and foreign invasion. The eternal struggle between Ma'at and Isfet gave Egyptian religion its drama and its urgency. The rituals had to be performed, the gods had to be honored, the pharaoh had to rule properly, not just because these were nice things to do, but because the very existence of the ordered world depended on them. This is why Akhenaten's disruption of the traditional religious system was seen as so catastrophic. By closing the temples and stopping the rituals, he was not just changing religious practices, he was threatening to unleash Isfet and bring about cosmic collapse. The Egyptian afterlife beliefs were also deeply connected to this concept of Ma'at. The judgment scene, where the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, was not just about individual moral accountability. It was about whether the deceased had lived in accordance with the cosmic order. Those who had maintained Ma'at in their lives would be justified and allowed to enter the blessed afterlife. Those who had violated Ma'at would be destroyed, devoured by Ammit, ceasing to exist. What counted as living in accordance with Ma'at? The various declarations of innocence that the deceased had to make in the judgment hall give us insight into Egyptian ethics. The deceased would declare that they had not killed, not stolen, not lied, not committed adultery, not caused anyone to weep, not been aggressive, not been angry without cause, not eaten their heart, a metaphor for giving in to despair or anger, not been deaf to words of truth and right, and many other similar declarations. These were not abstract moral principles, but practical ethics for living in community. Someone who lived according to these principles would be someone who contributed to social harmony and order, who embodied Ma'at in their daily life. It is worth noting that Egyptian religion was not primarily concerned with belief in the sense that later religions would emphasize. What mattered was not so much what you believed as what you did. Orthopraxy, correct practice, was more important than orthodoxy, correct belief. As long as you performed the proper rituals, made the proper offerings, followed the proper ethical principles, it did not particularly matter if you understood the theological complexities or if you had doubts about the mythology. The gods cared about actions, not thoughts. This emphasis on practice over belief made Egyptian religion remarkably tolerant in some ways. There was no concept of heresy in the traditional religion, no inquisition to root out wrong belief. People could hold different opinions about the gods, could prefer one deity over another, could even be somewhat skeptical about the mythology, as long as they participated in the communal rituals and fulfilled their religious obligations. This is why Akhenaten's revolution was so shocking. He was not just introducing a new god or a new theological interpretation. He was declaring that the old practices were wrong, that the old gods did not exist, that the entire system that had sustained Egyptian civilization for thousands of years was false. This was something unprecedented and unforgivable. The integration of religion into every aspect of life meant that changes in religion had ripple effects throughout society. When Akhenaten closed the temples, he was not just affecting religious practice. He was disrupting economic systems that employed hundreds of thousands of people. He was destroying social institutions that provided education, healthcare, and welfare. He was eliminating the festivals that brought communities together and gave rhythm and meaning to the year. He was cutting people off from the rituals that marked life's important transitions: birth, coming of age, marriage, death. The resistance to his reforms was not just about conservative attachment to tradition. It was about the practical reality that Egyptian society was built on and around its religious institutions, and destroying those institutions meant destroying the social fabric itself. The artistic legacy of ancient Egyptian religion is one of its most visible and enduring aspects. The temples, tombs, statues, and paintings that have survived provide a window into the religious world of the ancient Egyptians. These were not simply decorative or aesthetic productions. They were functional objects with religious purposes. A statue of a god in a temple was not just a representation of the god but was, in a very real sense, a dwelling place for the god's spirit. Through the proper rituals of consecration and the daily rites of care, the statue became alive, inhabited by the divine presence. The tomb paintings and reliefs served a similar function. They were not merely pictures, but had magical efficacy. An image of the deceased receiving offerings would ensure that offerings would continue to come to the deceased in the afterlife. A picture of the deceased working in the fields of paradise would make that experience real in eternity. The hieroglyphic texts were not just writing but were themselves powerful. To write something was to make it real, to give it existence. This is why Akhenaten's followers went around chiseling out the names of the old gods from inscriptions. They were not just censoring texts. They were trying to erase the very existence of those gods by removing their names from reality. The monumental architecture of Egyptian religion, the massive temples and pyramids, served multiple purposes. On the practical level, they were functional buildings where rituals could be performed and goods could be stored. On the social level, they were public works projects that employed thousands and demonstrated the power and wealth of the pharaoh and the gods. On the religious level, they were earthly dwellings for the gods, built to cosmic proportions to honor divine majesty. And on the symbolic level, they were models of the cosmos itself, with the temple representing the world and the sanctuary representing the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation. Walking through a temple like Karnak was meant to be a journey through space and time, from the outer world of ordinary reality through successive stages of increasing holiness until one reached the dark sanctuary at the heart of the temple where the god dwelt. The temple was built on an axis aligned with astronomical phenomena, so that at certain times of year, the sun's rays would penetrate deep into the temple, illuminating the sanctuary. Every aspect of the temple's design was laden with symbolic meaning, from the columns carved to resemble papyrus and lotus plants, evoking the primordial swamp from which the world emerged, to the ceiling painted with stars, representing the sky goddess Nut arching over the world. The priests who served in these temples were not just performing rote rituals. They were, in their understanding, maintaining the cosmos itself. Each morning's awakening of the god statue reenacted creation. Each offering presented to the god sustained the divine powers that kept the world functioning. The rituals connected past, present, and future, linking the priests performing them to the countless generations who had performed the same rituals before, and to the infinite future when these rituals would continue to be performed. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian religion, its attitude toward time. The Egyptians conceived of time not as a linear progression from past to future, but as a cyclical pattern of recurring events. The daily cycle of the sun's journey across the sky and through the underworld, the annual cycle of the Nile's flood, the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, all of these were patterns that repeated eternally. The rituals performed in the temples participated in and reinforced these cycles. The past was not dead and gone, but was continually present. The ancestors were still part of the community, residing in their tombs and participating in family celebrations during festivals. The first time, the Zep Tepi, when the gods created the world, was not a distant historical event, but a sacred paradigm that was reenacted and made present through ritual. When a pharaoh built a temple, he was not creating something new, but was restoring and renewing what had existed from the beginning. Even innovation had to be presented as restoration of ancient tradition. This cyclical view of time contributed to the remarkable conservatism of Egyptian culture. Change did occur, of course, but it occurred slowly and was usually presented not as innovation, but as return to proper ancient practice. This is why Akhenaten's revolution was so jarring. He was not claiming to restore ancient tradition, but was explicitly creating something new, something that broke with the past. His new city, Akhetaten, was built on land that had never before been occupied or claimed by any god. This was unprecedented. In Egyptian thinking, there was no such thing as unclaimed land. All land belonged to some god or had belonged to gods from the beginning of time. To claim virgin territory was to step outside the cosmic order, to create something disconnected from the eternal patterns. The eventual abandonment of Akhetaten and the return to Thebes was thus not just a political or practical decision, but a restoration of proper cosmic order. The court returned to the ancient capital, the temples were reopened, and the eternal cycles were resumed. Time, disrupted by Akhenaten's revolution, was put back on its proper course. We should also consider the relationship between Egyptian religion and Egyptian science and learning. To modern minds, religion and science are often seen as opposed or at least as separate domains. But for the Egyptians, they were intimately connected. The priests were the learned class, the ones who could read and write, who kept records, who studied the stars and the calendar, who practiced medicine, who developed mathematics and engineering for building temples and pyramids. The temple schools, the houses of life, were centers of learning where knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Young scribes would learn to read and write by copying religious texts, thus simultaneously learning literacy and absorbing religious teachings. The priests who studied astronomy did so primarily to determine the correct times for festivals and rituals, but in the process, they developed sophisticated understanding of celestial movements and could predict astronomical events with considerable accuracy. The priests who practiced medicine combined herbal remedies with magical spells, and while the magical component may seem superfluous to us, the herbal medicines they used were often genuinely effective. Egyptian mathematics developed in part to solve practical problems, like calculating the amount of grain in a granary or determining the workforce needed for a building project, but it also had religious applications in the design of temples and the calculation of ritual calendars. Egyptian engineering, which enabled the construction of the pyramids and massive stone temples, was driven largely by religious impulses, the desire to create fitting monuments to the gods and eternal dwellings for the dead. This integration of religion and learning meant that an attack on religion, as Akhenaten launched, was also an attack on the entire intellectual and educational system. The closing of the temples meant the closing of the schools. The persecution of the old priesthood meant the persecution of the learned class. This is yet another way in which Akhenaten's revolution disrupted Egyptian society far beyond the purely religious sphere. As we near the end of our journey through this world of 1,000 gods, it is worth reflecting on what this ancient religious world can teach us, or what questions it raises for us as modern people. The easy temptation is to see Egyptian religion as primitive superstition, a stage of human development that we have outgrown. But this is too simple and too self-satisfied. The Egyptians were not less intelligent than we are, and their religion was not a failure of reason, but a different way of making sense of the world and human experience. In a world without modern science, without understanding of natural laws, their religious explanations for natural phenomena were reasonable inferences from available evidence. More than that, their religion provided things that modern secular worldviews often struggle to provide: meaning, purpose, community, connection to the past and to the cosmos, comfort in the face of death, and frameworks for ethics and justice. The question of whether the gods actually existed is, in some ways, beside the point. What mattered was that the religious system worked for the Egyptians. It helped them make sense of their lives, gave them tools for dealing with uncertainty and suffering, created bonds of community and shared identity, and provided the foundation for one of the greatest civilizations in human history. That civilization endured for over 3,000 years, far longer than any modern nation-state has yet existed. Whatever we may think of the truth claims of Egyptian religion, we must acknowledge its practical success. At the same time, the story of Akhenaten reminds us that even successful religious systems have vulnerabilities and limitations. Akhenaten identified real problems: the excessive power of the priesthood, the complexity and incoherence of polytheistic mythology, perhaps even the tendency of elaborate ritual to become empty formalism. His solutions were too radical and too quickly imposed, but the problems he identified were genuine. The failure of his revolution demonstrates the resilience of established religious systems, but also their dependence on social consensus and institutional support. Religion is not just belief, but is embedded in practices, institutions, and social structures. Changing a religion means changing all of these dimensions, not just announcing new doctrines. Akhenaten tried to impose religious change by royal decree, without building popular support or allowing time for new practices and institutions to develop. The result was that when his strong hand was removed, the old system snapped back into place. In our modern world, where religious belief and practice are often matters of individual choice rather than communal obligation, where multiple religions coexist within single societies, where science provides alternative explanations for natural phenomena, and where secular institutions perform many functions once performed by religious institutions, we live in a very different religious landscape than the ancient Egyptians did. We cannot return to their world, nor would most of us want to. But we can perhaps appreciate what that world offered its inhabitants: a sense of living in an enchanted cosmos filled with meaning and purpose, where every action mattered and where humans, gods, and nature were interconnected in a great cosmic dance. We can appreciate the beauty of their art, the sophistication of their thought, the depth of their devotion. We can recognize that our modern ways of understanding the world, for all their advantages, also involve losses and trade-offs. And we can remember that the Egyptians, for all their differences from us, were fully human, with the same fundamental needs, hopes, and fears that we have. They loved their children, mourned their dead, sought meaning and purpose, hoped for justice, feared suffering and death, and tried to create beauty and order in a world that could be harsh and chaotic. Their gods and rituals and beliefs were their way of addressing these fundamental human concerns, and in that sense, their world is not as far from ours as we might initially think. As the sun sets now on our journey through ancient Egypt, as the golden light fades from the temples and the shadows lengthen across the desert, we can imagine ourselves standing once more on the banks of the Nile. The river flows on, as it has flowed for millions of years, as it flowed when the pharaohs ruled and the priests chanted in the temples, as it flows today when those temples stand in ruins and those gods are no longer worshipped. The world of 1,000 gods has passed away. Akhenaten's revolution failed and was forgotten for millennia. The restoration that followed him eventually gave way to new dynasties, foreign conquerors, changing times. The temples were closed, not by royal decree this time, but by the inexorable tide of historical change. Christianity and later Islam replaced the old gods. The hieroglyphs that had recorded the sacred mysteries became indecipherable. The great chain of tradition that had connected generation to generation for 3,000 years was broken. And yet, the ruins remain. The temples at Karnak and Luxor still stand, testament to the devotion and skill of those who built them. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings still hold their secrets. The pyramids still rise from the desert sands. The statues of gods and pharaohs still gaze out with their enigmatic stone eyes. And the written records, once deciphered, still speak to us across the millennia, telling us of a people who lived and loved, who built and created, who worshipped and celebrated, who faced the eternal mysteries of existence with courage, creativity, and profound spiritual imagination. Their answers to those mysteries are not our answers. Their gods are not our gods, if we have gods at all. Their world is not our world. But the questions they grappled with are still our questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? What gives life meaning? How do we deal with suffering? How do we create justice? How do we connect with something greater than ourselves? The world of 1,000 gods offers no simple answers for us, but it reminds us that these questions are ancient, that humans have always sought the sacred, that the drive to worship, to ritualize, to connect the human and the divine is as old as civilization itself. And perhaps, in our modern age that has in many ways lost touch with the sacred, there is something we can learn from a people who saw divinity everywhere, who made their entire world a temple, who understood that the everyday and the eternal, the human and the divine, are always intertwined. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Nile, the same stars that the ancient Egyptians saw and interpreted as gods and souls of the blessed dead, we can feel a connection across time to those ancient people. They are gone. Their civilization is gone. Their gods are gone. But their legacy remains, in the monuments they built, in the wisdom they recorded, in the questions they asked and the answers they proposed, in the simple fact that they were here, that they lived and thought and created and left their mark on the world. And so we bid farewell to ancient Egypt, to Thebes and Akhetaten, to Ammonius-Ra and the Aten, to the priests and pharaohs, to the craftsmen and farmers, to all those who inhabited this world of 1,000 gods. May their memory be eternal, may their call live forever, may they feast in the fields of paradise under the gaze of Osiris and Ra, may they be justified, true of voice, as they hope to be. And may we, in our own time and in our own way, find our own answers to the eternal questions they sought to answer, find our own ways to make meaning, to create beauty, to connect with the sacred, to live lives worthy of remembrance. The journey is complete. The story is told. The world of 1,000 gods has been explored and understood, as best we can understand it from our distant vantage point. Rest well, dear listener, and may your own dreams be filled with wonder and meaning, with gods or without them, in this world or the next. Thank you for traveling with me through time to ancient Egypt. Until our next journey together, may you walk in beauty, may you know peace, and may you find, in your own life and in your own way, that connection to something eternal that the ancient Egyptians sought with such devotion in their world of 1,000 gods. Good night, and sleep well.